transformative, genuinely radical, transformative left economic policies that this country needs, and how we get there, how we actually make that happen. Because I think that's the key to this. We can all have a nice chat about how terrible capitalism is. It's what you do about it that tends to be the really difficult bit, but also the really necessary bit. Patrick Allen, our chair of the Progressive Economy Forum, just want to say very few quick words at the end. The way I'm going to run this is we'll have some introductory comments from each of the speakers, around about 10 minutes or so each, and then I'll open to the floor for a discussion, for question answers, comments if they're short and not like crazy, and then we'll get the speakers back in at the end to sum up. But firstly, I'd just like Patrick to say a couple of words about what PEF is up to.
Thanks, James. Hello, everybody. I'm allowed 2 minutes. My name is Patrick Allen. I'm the founder and the chair of the Progressive Economy Forum. So I just want to tell you in a few words what we're about and why we started and about our new book. So 3 years ago, we were founded, and the idea was to oppose the economic policies of neoliberalism, and in particular austerity, and to propose progressive policies in their place. And the second aim was to create some means of communication between politicians and economists, which had not necessarily gone smoothly in the past. So we formed a council, and the heart of PEF is a council of 20 economists and other academics, all leaders in their field. 2 of our council are here today. That's James and Carolina. Guy and Carolina, and James is our recently appointed director. So in the first 3 years, we have held many events, public lectures and workshops, and we had a very fruitful relationship with John McDonnell's office, which is a great example of what we could do together. And then since then, we've been forging a relationship with Rachel Reeves, who came to our fringe event on Sunday. So when COVID arrived, it was quite clear that huge questions were being asked of economics, and all the normal things were being turned on their head, particularly right-wing ideas. So the state had to find billions of pounds to support businesses and people on furlough, and this idea that there was a limited amount of money, no magic money tree, was of course ridiculous. We decided that the time had come for us to create a book and to address the challenges which COVID and other issues were facing us. So we saw there were 4 huge challenges coming up. One was what to do about, after 11 years of austerity. One was what to do about the debts left behind by COVID. And then, of course, Brexit, which, as we speak, is causing chaos in the economy. And, of course, climate change with COP26 coming up and the government's response being inadequate. So we quickly called together our council members, and we have collected 20 essays into a book, which was published in May. And we've got copies here, which I hope you're going to buy. We have addressed, how do we get here, and ideas for the future. So it's a statement of what we're about. Anyway, I think my time is up. I'm going to hand over to James and for the rest of the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, thanks, Patrick. Okay, I'd like to start the meeting proper with Carolina Alves, our first speaker, who's teaches at Cambridge and is, as Patrick mentioned, a member of the Progressive Economy Forum Council. So, Carolina.
Thank you. Thank you, James and Patrick and PEF for putting this panel together. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. So when we're thinking about progressive intellectuals and policymakers and politicians, we can see that they have highlighted how unprepared society is when we have to face crisis, right? When you have to understand what's going on in situations such as the pandemic or, for example, the global financial crisis in 2007 and 2008. And very often we see as well the discussion behind how a kind of a certain inability or even an intellectual deficiency that these intellectuals they have in terms of trying to point it out what is wrong or why crises are happening in the first place. And the more progressive, hopefully, this intellectual, this policymaker is, we can see that the discussion is not about the role of finance or any specific problem just about the public health system, but also broader like issues that are running much deeper and wider, such as problems regarding industrial policies and employment policies, or even a housing policy, and also changes in the labor market. And sometimes we can see this intellectual discussion as well, the implications that we have been trying to deal with of globalization. And of course, these discussions in turn make us to think about the impact that neoliberal policies have had in the last 30 years. So it's very often then that we see the discussion that we have in these progressive forums taking us to thinking about what is the alternative. So we discuss, the role of the state, or Keynesian kind of policies, or sometimes the restructuring of the economy for the common good, or the need of policies, the full employment policies, or even a way to intervene and control how corporations are run. And that basically is our book. I don't know where it is anymore. You can find that discussion there. And although I do agree with all this, I think we have issues that are running deeper and wider than just the pandemic or the role of finance. I would like to bring to our discussion today 2 points. One is about the economics as a discipline, which is what I teach. So I hope I'm not going to get too academic. And the other aspect is the relationship between that economics and welfare state and policies of social provisioning. So regarding the first point, which is the economic as a discipline, I would like to discuss a little bit the relationship between economics and its pro-market approach. So economists, they like to say they have nothing to do with neoliberal policies. And sometimes it's very difficult to discuss with them because I'm just doing economics. That's not really neoliberalism. But what I would like to highlight here is how modern economics is a science that is biased towards the market. It has a market-oriented approach regarding how we organize our society, our economy. And this approach basically tells us, and then we teach our students, that then after that you'll be involved in elaborating policies or in other positions of power, that we see human interactions, they are thought to happen mainly through the market. And we theorize this market in terms of this mutual interaction between demand and supply. And of course, getting a little bit technical here, we have the concept of market equilibrium as a central concept in that analysis. So this kind of approach has had implications regarding how the discipline comes to view the state. And of course, it then paved the way of how we then move to present a version of a state where you can justify its minimal capacity, its actions are limited to necessities such as law enforcement, providing national defense, and so on. Now, of course, all this is not new. Many of you are saying, now, well, we know about that. But my point here is that we have to start holding the economic profession accountable for that view, that very narrow view that equals basically economic sphere to markets. It's not about going them, so like this is neoliberalism. It's about having a market approach that is at the heart of modern economics, which then, of course, has influenced public policy, especially in the UK, but across the globe over the past half century. So this is not, I really would like to emphasize that, this is not really about holding a neoliberal view. Is also, but that's a different discussion, but it's about focusing on markets or having a market bias that is, as I said, at the heart of this modern economics. And from my perspective, if we don't address this, if we don't hold the economic profession regarding that view, we are letting economists to get away with that. So we need to kind of be a little bit more aware about what we are teaching to our students and in future policymakers, and have that kind of a discussion when they look at us and say, well, but I'm not a neoliberal, you know, and then say like, okay, which kind of economics are you relying on, what you're teaching? And that takes me to my second point, which is the welfare state and social provisioning. So we know that it's possible to track back with evidence how this kind of market fundamentalism is behind much of the weakening of the state that has happened that happens in US and UK in the 1980s. And here I want to point out two aspects. This is related to economics, to a discipline having this bias where, you know, markets, they are this efficient allocator of resource that then show us two tendencies here, two trends. The first one is this vilification of the state that's familiar to many of us, which goes alongside the celebration of market efficiency, which then, of course, has led to this kind of the lack of resilience in the organization of social provisioning, which we've seen with the pandemic, for example, in terms of the number of hospital beds we had available in NHS here. So the second point, which is more recent one, is regarding austerity and how austerity has driven government deficit reduction, spending cuts, and attempts to dismantle social welfare system across the world. Now, again, and you can say to me, well, Carolina, that's not new, and it's not. We all know about that. But what I would like to highlight here is that these market lenses that we have, in all of us at some point we have this kind of a view that's all about the market. We become less creative regarding the alternatives, or regarding how we can come up with solutions that, in a way, is not or about being against the market or correcting market failures. And here, what I mean is, if you think in terms of this market approach or this market fundamentalism, what happens is we have economists actually trying to think in terms of supporting policies that will somehow give the apparatus that's needed for this, you know, for the competitive markets to work, or we have economists actually not being favorable to kind of policies that involve regulation or redistribution or even a more market intervention. So we know about that. But my point is, we all, because of that 2 points, we end up not having economists being more creative in terms of thinking, for example, about how a planned economy would work. What is a planned economy? What is planning in that circumstances? So more than often, economists, they can't think, even when they are criticizing the market, they can't think in terms of a kind of mechanism that's not about market prices or supply and demand. What is even more important here, and sadly it happens, is that our critique as progressive economists is regarding looking to this kind of planned or planning something or economy that we can kind of bring in planning to have a more central role. We can't see that. We can't be creative about that. And we look at this planned kind of field and we see in a very negative way. We don't see that as providing a solution for issues. We see that in contrast with market. So market works, and here is the option. But we don't think of that option in a more independent way. So, you know, it's always as there's a famous economist that actually was involved in the creation of the welfare state in UK, Barbara Wootton, a female economist that doesn't get much in the spotlight, and she highlighted that when you're thinking about planning when it comes to economics, it's like we want the irrational instead of the rational. There is even this negative connotation, and I think we should try to move away from that. And that's important because especially if you're trying to think that way, we may be able to go back to trying to understand welfare state and social provisioning, not in terms of market failure or any kind of support, but in terms of a system called capitalism, where is a system full of contradictions, full of crises, and you need a constant type of social policies and a system of social provision that can help us to go through that. And then when we have the pandemic or the global financial crisis, these are specific historical circumstances where we go back to this welfare state, this kind of general theory of a general state that you should have within capitalism. And then in that historical moment, we decide what we need here. So I know we are all here very nostalgic about the welfare state we had, especially in the UK after the World War, but that's after the World War. What we need is a conception of welfare state within capitalism. Then when we have the pandemic, that's what we need from that general framework. When you have a socialism war as we had after the Second World War, then is what we need from that system, from that welfare theory. So this is my 2 points today, to be very aware of what economics is, this kind of marketed approach. And regarding to that, to be a little bit more creative regarding how we think about alternative. What is that alternative we want, especially when it comes to welfare state and social policies?
Thank you. Thank you, Carolina, for an excellent scene-setting introduction on market fundamentalism and why you should never trust an economist. I'm going to hand over to, okay, with rare exceptions, I'm now going to hand over to someone who isn't an economist, but who has been attempting to build that alternative Caroline's been talking about. It's Matthew Brown, leader of Preston City Council.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I think we need to look at just really think about where we are and where we've been, not just in the last few months and years with the pandemic, but in the last few decades. Because when I was born in the 70s, obviously a third of people lived in social housing, council housing. I think the share of wages paid in the economy was 68%. Trade union membership was 2/3. Obviously, those trends have really gone downwards in the sense that we've had a lot of the wealth of the economy sold off, deregulation, privatisation, attacks on trade unions and the rest. And obviously, you know, members of trade unions now and the wealth of the economy paid in wages is a lot lower. So obviously, those are the trends, and it was an international attack on workers' rights. So obviously, we had a lot of it, but obviously America as well under Reagan had a lot of it too. And obviously, we did get a Labour government from 97 to 2010. Some good things done around tackling child and pensioner poverty, and obviously invested in public services, but there wasn't that radical transformation that a Labour government with that majority could have done to actually change the system and actually put more public ownership in the economy and tackle the inequalities which stabilised but didn't reduce. So that's where we're coming from. Now, obviously, we got to 2007-8, and then we had the economic crash, and obviously that was caused by the failure of governments to actually tackle, you know, financial capitalism and how it works and how it is potentially disruptive and destructive to economies. So obviously, from that, the payback was austerity. So when we get to the Brexit referendum of 2016, you feel an anger amongst working class communities. And, you know, I voted to remain. It was marginal, but I thought on balance it was best to remain in and try to reform the European Union. But you can understand where communities that had a lot of richness, not perfect by any stretch of the imagination in the 60s and 70s, but better paid jobs, a lot of pride, that social infrastructure around working men's clubs, trade union membership, the cooperative movement as well was much bigger. When that's taken away, they're going to be angry. So they're going to be tempted to want to kick the establishment and also obviously vote for Brexit. And it's quite interesting how in America, Donald Trump was successful in 2016 or 17, can't remember, but he was successful unexpectedly. And, you know, sadly, I was watching that American election, being the geek I was at about 4 in the morning, and the commentators are saying this, that, and the other. And, you know, one of the commentators said, well, this is a primal scream of the working class in the American Rust Belt. You know, and I thought, well, that really says a lot, doesn't it? That people, working people, have really been through a lot, and they're reacting in ways which are kind of like not basically within the centre of politics, whether it's left or right. People are wanting change of some kind or the other. So obviously, Jeremy Corbyn's election 2017, fantastic. We did really well, and we captured that spirit, and obviously we've gone backwards. But I just think because people do want change and they're trying to, they want fundamental change and they want improvements to their life. I think having a return to some kind of bland managerialism within the Labour Party is not going to get us anywhere, and we're going to go into further decline, to be honest. And this is why I just cannot understand why the current national leadership is not, in many ways, and not perfect, taking a few examples from what's happening with the Democratic Party in America, because Joe Biden has brought the left into the conversation. Sanders and Biden appear together at rallies. Elements of the Green New Deal they're accepting. We seem to be, we could learn lessons from them, to be honest. And obviously the Labour Party is traditionally more to the left of the Democratic Party, but it is depressing that we are where we are. But obviously, as a local council leader, I've been trying to, with colleagues like Antonio and others, obviously big support from John and James as well, lead a conversation about how we must respond to these inequalities and try to change the system where we're in power anyway. So obviously the Preston model, we're trying to do that. So we're trying to put a concept of economic democracy into our local economy. Now, again, local government has been disempowered, and this was I think it was a tactic of the Thatcher government onwards, and John was caught up in this as well in the GLC, obviously. So what we can do is very restricted. So I came to the conclusion some time back that we've got to try and put new democratic institutions with the support of Labour councils into communities. So within Preston, we're working with colleagues to establish a regional cooperative bank to challenge the large banks and the fact they're withdrawing from our high street. We work with our institutions, so we encourage them to be living wage employers, to in-source services, to buy goods and services locally, to get our pension funds to actually directly invest within our communities. We're expanding worker and employee ownership, and we're really working especially with our BME communities and the unions to actually do that, to say, well, listen, you don't have to work for a boss, you can actually self-organise in a worker cooperative. The council itself, after holding the hands of global developers for a decade and nothing happening within our city centre to try and bring in with investment, we're actually developing the city. Quite a small council, but we're building a cinema leisure development that will be in local public ownership. So, it will make a profit, hopefully, and any profits go back to the community. But crucially, we have a say over local supply chains as well. We're looking how we can re-establish council housing again, and this is happening in many places. Then we're looking at things around community land trusts and other ways to actually put that democracy, which has been taken away from us, back into our local economies. So this movement is called Community Wealth Building, and it's quite significant that at a conference, I think it was on Sunday, that the Communication Workers Union have actually got behind this movement, because they're seeing what they can do with Crown post offices and how they can actually really try to work to transform local economies, hopefully with Labour councils, to actually benefit communities and support these economic alternatives. I mean, food purchasing cooperatives, we're looking at this in Preston, where families come together and purchase food together as a cooperative, legally constituted, to save food bills. And I think this is how we respond locally and regionally to this kind of like disempowerment that communities have had in the last 40 years. And we've got to try doing that, because if we don't do it locally and nationally, I just think we're going to lose more support, because people are voting in ways that are unconventional, because everything's been disrupted really badly in the last few decades, really. So we've got to be aware of that and vote for that as well. But crucially, obviously, a lot about Preston, and in some ways I don't like the publicity we're getting, because I want to deliver it on the ground, really. Before I'm chucked out of politics as leader, which is always a possibility with my views or whatever, I want to make sure I finish the job off. But, it's not just in Preston, it is in many places where community wealth building is growing. So obviously Mark Drakeford is himself within Wales supporting a community bank. He's looking at a UBI, I believe. We got the Merv Salford, who's going to build 3,000 council houses through a publicly owned company. Islington has in-sourced, I think, £320 million worth of services, which has meant that 1,400 people get the London living wage, get a pay rise. We're looking at energy democracy in certain places. In Liverpool City region, Joanne Anderson and Steve Rotherham, they're looking how they can actually use the land and assets to deliver community land trusts and other forms of not-for-profit businesses. So this is a movement that actually wasn't taking place and wasn't even being discussed 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, I was elected to Preston Council about 18 years ago now, and obviously I was coming out with these ideas, and they're saying, oh, he's mad, this one, isn't he? You know what I mean? But But crucially, you know, these conversations are now everywhere because I think people realise the system needs to change because of those inequalities, and the current economic system is failing everyone. It only benefits not just the top 1%, the top 0.1%. But even more exciting than this, you know, we've come across some quite, you know, I spend a lot of time with Americans these days because they did actually influence a lot of our work, and how even in America, you know, the bastion of free market capitalism, they talk about an America beyond capitalism. You go to New York and they're looking at worker and employee ownership there to actually tackle, you know, the racial injustice that you see, because obviously, you know, if you're someone with a BME background, inequalities are even worse in America. Chicago, they've just adopted a couple of months back a community wealth building strategy, the whole city. And then in Los Angeles and San Francisco, they're looking to establish a publicly owned bank so they're actually not at the mercy of Wall Street with the damage that does. So, you know, the Labour Party cannot ignore these conversations that are taking place. And obviously, you know, John and myself has done in February, we launched our strategy, Deputy Mayor of New York City. These are quite influential figures that are actually coming out with these ideas. And obviously, we need to capture this moment that people want change. The current system isn't working. At least locally and regionally, try to start a conversation about how we can actually move to the next system gradually in a way that's proportionate and is actually going to move us beyond capitalism eventually. Because obviously, you know, I think we're conditioned to think there can't be another system apart from the current one, but there can. You know, I mean, Ted Howard, a friend of mine in America, says it's like, you know, in Egypt, they're always told the pharaohs would exist for like, for hundreds of years, and obviously they moved beyond that system as well. So, you know, we need open minds and a creativity going forward to actually win these ideas and get them into communities, really. And obviously, you know, I mean, it's not about personalities, any of this. I just really hope that the national leadership realise that, and Keir's 10 pledges, if he sticks to that, fantastic. But if he doesn't, it's obviously down to, you know, to local and regional leaders potentially to, you know, actually deliver a lot of the socialism on the ground, really, and hope we can win the argument that way. So again, thanks for the invite. Looking forward to hearing the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Matthew. I want to hand over to Antonia Jennings from the think tank, the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, which, as Matthew says, has actually done a lot of work with Preston and other councils and local authorities across the country and this sort of thing. But I think Antonia can talk a bit more about that.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, James, and thanks, Patrick, for the invitation to speak today. And yeah, lovely to see so many people here. So when I was preparing for today, I was thinking about the title, Winning the Case for Transformative Left Economics. And within that, the phrase winning the case really stuck out. Winning the case is very much a process, it's a journey, and it's not solely about the final destination. It's about all of the multifaceted competing factors that feed into that process. So maybe in the case of, you know, TWT and the transformative left economic agenda, the final destination is a progressive Labour Party in power. But before that, when we're thinking about the journey, surely it's also about movement building, so building support for a transformative left economic agenda. It's also figuring out exactly what that agenda is, what are the policies and ideas that are meeting, you know, the current crises of today. And also, and I think progressives don't focus on this enough, it's about proving these ideas work. So it's about building an evidence base for them, perhaps on the local level, which is what I'm going to focus on, so that when we're trying to scale them on the national level, we know that they're affordable, they're feasible, they're viable, etc. So thinking about those three parts of the journey, so where's the energy, where's the movement, where are the ideas, and where are we testing the ideas? For me, it is really clear that a lot of that is happening on the local level. Within the national political landscape, it's on the local levels that progressives currently actually have power. And colleagues like Matthew and others that have been mentioned, are actually delivering this agenda. And today, they are transforming lives and building the evidence base. So thinking about the last few years, obviously 2019 didn't go the way many of us hoped, but the local elections this year painted a much more nuanced and hopeful picture. And I think the main takeaway for me was that it showed there is absolutely no absence of appetite for progressive politics for this transformative left-wing economic agenda. And as Matthew mentioned, where we saw Labour putting forward locally rooted leaders standing on progressive platforms, they bucked the national trend, retaining and often gaining seats. So, of course, that's Matthew Brown, it's Mark Drakeford in Wales, it's Paul Dennett in Salford. But then also, when we expand outside of the Labour Party, it also applies in large part to the SNP and the Greens as well. So, thinking about the type of progressive platforms that a lot of these people stood on, as Matthew alluded to, they stood on a platform of community wealth building, or variants of it. It's a very all-encompassing term, and it's also an iterative term that I'll talk about a little bit in a moment. But I guess at its heart, community wealth building is a model for inclusive economic development, and it's a direct antidote to local economic development models that have dominated in the past, specifically focused on inward investment and extractive capitalism. So I'll talk about the sort of policies that constitute it in a little bit more detail, but I think one thing to think about community wealth building is what the core objectives of it is, and they're actually quite simple. I think there's a discussion to be had around how we actually communicate community wealth building. I think we're quite underdeveloped as progressives in that space compared to some of the national policy things that we talk about. But at its core, community wealth building has two very simple objectives. It's to ensure that wealth generated in a community stays in that community, and secondly, that the amount of wealth generated within a community is maximized. That's all it's trying to do. So on to the more kind of wonky end of it, or the policies that sit within it. So in most conceptions of it, although it's a contested concept, it's got 5 main pillars or areas. First, and possibly most famous, is around progressive procurement. So that's looking at essentially how public institutions are spending their money, who they're giving contracts to, and it's trying to put forward the case that contracts, where possible, should be given to locally rooted, generative businesses. So to put that into a tangible example for you, if you're a council and you know over the next 10 years you've got to retrofit 80,000 homes, and for example that's going to equate to £10 million in contracts for construction firms, perhaps a traditional economic development approach would say, right, well, quickest bang for buck is we'll get a big multinational construction firm in, we'll give them the 10 million quid in one go and sort of ignore the fact that they're possibly housed in the Cayman Islands and not doing anything particularly generative for our community. A community wealth building approach would say, right, well, we know today that over the next 10 years we're going to have this £10 million in contracts. How can we ensure that they go to local suppliers? Perhaps it's about upskilling the local supply base. Perhaps the local supply base doesn't exist. Perhaps it's about divvying up that £10 million into smaller sized chunks so that different components of it can be delivered by different firms. Or perhaps it's about embedding social value criteria that mean only a local firm could deliver that type of contract. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar is around just labour markets. So put simply, that's just about promoting good quality, well-paid jobs in communities. I guess in terms of policy terms, it's about obviously advancing the living wage agenda, demanding that of contractors, making sure the public sector is paying that in-house and for its outsourced services. But it's also stimulating labour market demand in needed areas, both today and the ones that we know are coming up. And it's also looking at progressive recruitment practices. So it's, for example, a council looking at the fact that it has an unemployment crisis looming in hospitality due to COVID, and it's matching it up with the need for care workers and figuring out whether there's a labour market programme that can retrain people. The third pillar is around land and property. So again, it's looking at public sector land and assets and what they're doing with them and whether they're benefiting the community. So for example, if you're an NHS trust that has to balance the books, make savings, perhaps a traditional economic development approach would just be to sell it off to the highest bidder as quick as possible. A community wealth building approach would look at whether there's an opportunity for a community asset transfer or low carbon electricity generation on that land. And I guess crucially, through all of these pillars, one of the core arguments for community wealth building is that by advancing community wealth, you are in turn reducing the demand on public services. So actually, if you're the NHS Trust and you're developing, instead of selling off your land, you're putting low carbon electricity generation on it, it's the fact that you're factoring in, that's going to reduce fuel poverty in your area and take the burden off the trust itself. So it's a more holistic kind of planning process. So the fourth pillar is around financial power, which frankly is just looking at the financial levers that are in place both locally and nationally. So of course it's looking at the pots of funding that are available, but it's also looking at things such as, for example, public sector pension pots and whether they're being used to invest locally. And the final pillar is around plural ownership, which Matthew spoke to a little bit. So it's basically looking at stimulating different types of ownership within your local communities. So we know, evidence shows time and time again, that a resilient local economy is a diverse local economy. So it's supporting, of course, the SMEs on your high street, but also cooperatives, social enterprises, community interest companies, etc. So just before I wrap up, I think the key thing that I wanted to convey is that this is a model that's currently successfully being implemented across the country, and it's, in my mind, a critical ingredient to winning the case for this transformative left economic agenda. It's also providing that evidence base that I spoke about, and it's hopefully providing an evidence base for potentially a national manifesto later down the line. And it's also serving, I would like to think, to provide a lot of hope for progressives at the moment. This is a very difficult time for progressives. We haven't had a easy few years of it. But I would like to think that community wealth building and more broadly progressive action on the local level is something to mobilize around and get excited about. And finally, as progressives, presumably we are progressives because we desperately want to improve citizens' lives. This country faces multiple interrelated, overlapping crises. Almost any aspect of society you look at is currently in crisis, whether it's housing, inequality, health, climate, etc. And these crises are crises that are literally killing people today. And to be frank about it, we know that the political landscape is not likely to roll out transformative left economics on a national level anytime soon. We've had the Tories in power for 11 years. It doesn't look like that's going to change, in the short to medium term future. And so as progressives, in my mind, we have a choice. We have two choices. We can choose to sit about and sort of hope that, firstly, a progressive leader gets elected for the Labour Party, and then that leader goes on to win a national election. Or we can get on with changing lives today and in turn making a progressive leader and then winning a national election a hell of a lot more likely. Thanks.
Thank you, Antonia, for that kind of practically focused attention to what we can do now that isn't just being miserable about the state of the world, but God knows there's some choices of things to be miserable about. So looking for someone to lift us up a bit, I'm going to turn to Guy Standing, who's on the PEF Council, an economist, member of the PEF Council, who's going to talk for 10 minutes or so about the precarious and other such issues.
Okay, can you hear me? Is this working? Yeah, it sounds like it. I'm going to make a slightly different type of presentation. I think we are at a critical transformative moment, a genuine global crisis akin to Karl Polanyi's idea of a great transformation, in which we can either go towards an authoritarian neo-fascist populism, which is quite possible, or we will have a new progressive vision, agenda, and strategy. And I wanted to use that context because I've used it in a book on the corruption of capitalism, and this fellow renegade kindly endorsed the book because it's essentially saying that at this moment we don't have a free market economy, and it is incorrect for people to say, as Starmer has said himself, that the free market is failing. The reality is we haven't tried a free market. I don't wish for us to try a free market. But actually what we have today is the most unfree market economy that has ever been created. And that, I think, is a fundamental starting point. And I think we on the left will only gather strength when we have a narrative based on the existing type of capitalism, which is rentier capitalism, not free market capitalism. And it has to be a narrative that is oriented to the insecurities and the aspirations of the emerging mass class. And that isn't the 19th century proletariat, it's the 21st century precariat. And unless we reach out to the precariat with a narrative and a vocabulary and a set of images that appeal to the precariat, we will continue to wander with our same set of use of words and so on. And I want to highlight a few key points of rentier capitalism, because we don't have a neoliberalism. The neoliberalism phase of Thatcher and Reagan ushered in a period where we have morphed gradually to this rentier capitalism. And essentially what the Big Bang did in the 1986 was essentially enthrone finance. So finance has become the leading tail that is waving the dog. If I tell you that back in the 1980s, finance accounted for 2–3% of GDP around the world. Today, it's many times that. The financial assets of financial institutions today are worth over 1,000% of GDP. And essentially, we have private equity taking over companies. Over 4,000 companies in this country now are owned by private equity. And what private equity does is chase short-term profit maximizing. It's called termite capitalism by some, and then sell assets and maximize profits. We've also seen a conglomeration taking place. Contrary to a free market, we have less and less in terms of capital dominating, and that has led to a multiple pickup of prices over costs. So the markups have multiplied fivefold in many sectors because there isn't a market. But essentially the biggest thing that's happened was a little thing called TRIPS in 1994, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property. And what that did was globalize the US intellectual property regime. So today we have over 15 million patents in operation. Copyright is global and extensive, industrial brands, etc. What all of this does is it deliberately gives monopoly profits to corporations for 20 years. If you have a patent, nobody can compete with you for 20 years. And in the case of pharmaceuticals, with what's called evergreening, they can extend that to 40 years. Now, if this is a free market, I'm a duck. And I'm not very good at quacking. But essentially, intellectual property rights has led to a process which we economists called hoovering. Because big capital, big finance, hoover up the patents, string them together, and turn it into a fantastic monopolistic flow of billions of dollars, pounds, euros. We must understand that unless we have a narrative that is based on the realities rather than talk about free markets, we won't capture the imagination of ordinary people. Another thing that's happened along with that drift is the subsidy state has become incredibly powerful. In this country today, there are 1,190 forms of tax relief that are effectively a form of subsidy. Don't believe me? I've got a spreadsheet from the Treasury which details all of these tax reliefs and subsidies. And believe me or not, the Treasury says it cannot calculate what 900 of those costs the Treasury in lost revenue. But of the 210 or whatever that they can calculate, it means we have a foregone revenue of over £400 billion a year. Now, that's got nothing to do with a free market, for Christ's sake, or whoever's sake we are. It is a form of rentier capitalism. And that process goes with the new class structure that has emerged. And unless we understand the nature of the precariat and the insecurities they're experiencing and the forms of inequality, I've written a little book called The Plunder of the Commons. The commons are our common heritage. They belong to all of us. But in this period, what has happened is the privatization, the commodification, and the neo-colonial capture of our commons. It's not a free market, it's an acquisition of our commons. Our seabed has just been auctioned off by the royal estate. And they will get billions of revenue stretching for years. That's not a free market. So today we are at a stage where I believe we need a new rhetoric, a new vocabulary, a new sense of saying the left is going to deal in class politics. We only make progress when our agenda is couched in class. That's when the forward march will be renewed. I am not pessimistic. I believe we are on the edge of something exciting. I wish I were younger in the sense that I think the energy out there is fantastic. But it does mean we're going to have to struggle. Revive the commons. Go for a basic income that I was talking about here yesterday. We have to think of a new income distribution system that's suited to dealing with rentier capitalism. But I think we shouldn't be down and out. We have a temporary phase, but that's a temporary phase. I believe that some people in this sort of room are going to be championing a new vocabulary, a new imagery. And that's what we need. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Guy. And now I'd like to ask someone who is going to be left with a difficult job of trying to summarise some of the discussion. Well, he said he was going to do this earlier, so I'm going to hold him to it. It probably doesn't need much introduction. It's the former Shadow Chancellor, my old boss, John McDonnell.
Thanks. I don't know whether you've seen the tweets yet. The Bakers Union has just decided to disaffiliate from the Labour Party, which is really saddening, really saddening. This was one of the founding unions, and the statement they've put out is, well, it reflects actually what Guy has been saying, that the current leadership of the Labour Party seems to be taking us down a road that distances itself from our own class. That's the tragedy here. I think we can win them back, and that's all the work that I'll be doing. I work with the Bakers Union over the years, speak at every one of their conferences and on every one of their strikes, picket lines, and been their voice in Parliament. So we'll do all we can to win them back. Okay. On a lighter note, okay. A few years ago, Rachel Reeves did a booklet on everyday economics. And it was good. It was really good. And I invited her in for a cup of tea. And it was really good. This sounds arrogant, because it was almost like a short essay on everything we've been saying on the Labour front bench for the past 2 years. And I brought her in and complimented her. And so I thought it was really good. And I was trying to engage her in our Treasury team to lead on issues around inequality. Can you remember, James? And it was excellent. So some of the stuff she's been saying I've been quite pleased with. Well, there was an interview a short while ago in which, I don't know whether you saw it, they said, your predecessor said he was a Marxist or he'd read Marx and read Capital and all the rest. Have you? And she said, no, I haven't read Marx. Now, that's hard to believe, but the funny thing was, this week, someone sent me and said, look, I've sent this to Rachel, and I want you to have a copy as well, because I think she should read Marx. So I've summarized Capital 1 and 2 in this little booklet. You've got to think that's a sense of achievement, isn't it? Eh? No, it's quite a good selection, actually. It's quite good. So what we're going to do now, we're going to close the door and we're going to set up a working group to read the booklet. Okay, look, my job as Shadow Chancellor, I saw as appearing on television in a suit, tie, a reasonable haircut, polish my shoes, and to try and incite as many revolutionary movements as I possibly could across the whole of our economy and society. And, but this will be taped. You can see what the Tories are going to do on this, can't you? You can't use the word revolutionary anymore, so it was transformative. Okay. And literally it was that exercise. So Guy was, you can see where I get it from. Guy was one of my advisors, so was James, and I'd worked with Matt over the years. I was going to say man and boy, but we'd worked together over the years, basically. And what was wonderful about Patrick Allen is he came along and said, look, we're going to fund the setting up of an independent think tank in which we can challenge the neoliberal hegemony that there is within our society at the moment. So it was just, Patrick, thanks for that. It was just a breath of fresh air. And without your support, a lot of the debates that are taking place now wouldn't have happened. But as in all things, when you put a number of economists together, they row like hell all the time. And actually, you must probably get better theory and better decision-making out of that. And what you've seen today on the platform is part of the summary of where we tried to intervene. And what was interesting, there are a few opportunities in my life where we've been able to challenge the prevailing capitalist system. The banking crash in 2008, when that happened, there was a limited period of time in which people realized how the system worked or didn't work. And what I found really interesting at that time was if you talk to people from the city, you realize that they didn't know how the system worked either. And you realize that the fear that they had was that they woke up and realized nobody is in control. And it was like that. It was like that thing in the film where they reach the end of the yellow brick road, and they meet the guy, and instead of the big voice comes out and they pull the curtain back, and he's just moving levers and all this sort of thing. It was exactly like that. People were in a state of shock, and there was a window of opportunity where we could have actually taken that fear and understanding and anxiety about no one is in control here. How the hell is this system working? We could have had an opportunity then from the Labour Party to actually then insert into that the sort of analysis that Guy has given you about the rigged economy that there is. And we lost that. We lost that. We tried and all the rest. I was the first MP to raise Northern Rock on the floor of the House of Commons. Vince claimed he did. No, he didn't. I did, cheeky sod. Anyway, and what happened, Yvette Cooper was on the front bench. She ran out to get a briefing and all the rest. And at that point, we said, look, these banks are collapsing. Nationalise them. Nationalise them. And then someone dug out an interview with me and put it on the Twitter a few weeks back. And we said, nationalise them. And Labour refused to move. Alistair Darling, sorry, you get these confusions going on this age. Alistair Darling was the Chancellor at the time. And I said, you've got to nationalise them. We've got to take control. We've got to insert an element of planning into the financial system because it's falling apart. Actually, he refused, but 2 weeks later he did. And I got up and said, well, you did. And he said, to give me his due, he turned around to me and said, you've been calling for the nationalisation of the banks for 30 years. Are you going to get it right one day, aren't you? And that was it. But that was an opportunity. But those waters very quickly closed over that opportunity. And because we never challenged it, because we never had a serious, exactly as Guy said, narrative to challenge that, what happened is that the Tories very cleverly turned around and convinced people it was nothing to do with the system itself. It was all about overspending by a Labour government. And that was the foundation of the austerity programme that they actually used to ensure that they propped up their economic system. They made sure it was the poor that paid for the crisis, and they made sure that they could attack the state that they always wanted to either privatise or undermine. And it was because we never had an alternative narrative, and I suppose lacked courage and determination as well. So when Jeremy got elected, our whole point was to try and challenge every front we possibly could. And that was, exactly as has been said, it was trying to challenge the way in which economics was taught as well. And I can remember those students in Manchester who stood up and said, look, we need a conversation about heterodox economics rather than just orthodox economics. And there was a large number of people who, up until then in academia, were quite, in some ways, intimidated about trying to break out of that narrow framework. And it was, you know, as Guy said, it was the market always is best, the hidden hand of the market, always get the optimum solution. But people then started to challenge that. And what we found from that as well is the development of an architecture of left think tanks. James with New Economics Foundation, there's a whole range of them then started coming together. Claire's was developed before that, but then had a new lease of life, Class and others. And they were beginning to hegemonize the debate around economics, but it was political economy, not just economics. It was about how, therefore, you translate your understanding of capitalism in the mechanisms for changing it. And that was our work. It was around making sure that there were individual issues that we confronted, but we confronted it by trying to support social movements in those political fields. So, for example, there was an understanding that the tax system stank, and that there was huge levels of tax avoidance, etc. And Prem Seeker and I and John Christian had been organising their meetings in Parliament. One of the most important revolutionary roles I've played is booking rooms in the House of Commons for organisations. So for years I'd been doing that, and no one turned up, apart from the economists. Then all of a sudden, a group of young people turned up called UK Uncut, started occupying places, and all of a sudden, tax justice became an issue. And what we tried to do is, on each of those issues that were challenging the prevailing ethos, the prevailing narrative, was to ensure that we were supporting those organisations. As they identified an issue, we actually then supported them in those individual struggles. And that was about individual campaigns, whether it was about global justice or tax justice, but also it was about individual trade union struggles as well. Because that's where the hard element of reality hits you. And the point that Guy made, the hardest elements were around, we've had a dispute over this. He calls it the precariat. I just think I can never convince people of the word precariat, but I can't find anything else. So the hardest struggles were around all those working on zero-hour contracts, the cleaners with 4 or 5 jobs, etc. So part of our job as well, and also NHS workers and others, social carers, part of our job was to ensure that we inserted our transformative economic discussions into the harsh reality of those disputes. That's why we were on so many picket lines supporting those disputes, because on those picket lines, you started talking about how the system worked. And in that way, people began to understand not just why they were being screwed by that particular company or by that public service management, but also by the system overall. And again, our job was to ignite not just the struggle, because that was going to happen anyway, but it was to ignite the discussions and debates on those particular picket lines, in those occupations, and in those debates and discussions within particular unions or organizations or social movement initiatives in which they could then determine how best to move forward. And the key element was always for us is how then do you link all that, the ideological work, the intellectual struggles that are taking place with all these individual movements to demonstrate that there is a commonality of struggle here against the system, exactly as Guy set out in his book, and the book is brilliant. It's how you ensure there's a commonality of understanding that this system is corrupt and has to be challenged. Final point on this, James is going to shut me up. The final point on this is that there's an external reality that's coming at us fast that demonstrates that this system isn't working, can't work, and is actually putting us all at risk. And that's the existential threat of climate change. So again, what we've got now is an opportunity of using that as a mechanism to both raise levels of consciousness about the threat of climate change, but also to link that to exactly what Guy has said, the class struggle. Because it'll be the working class, it will be the working class in the global south in particular, who are the ones that will suffer as a result of this system, not only failing to tackle climate change, but a system which actually contributes towards the crisis itself. I think that's where we're at. Now, I've just got to sit down and convince Keir Starmer of that. But wait for it. The reality is, on the floor of conference this week, leave aside all the rubbish around constitutional change, on the floor of conference this week, our delegates have demonstrated all these issues are so relevant and that we have the ability to debate them and bring up those solutions. Look at the resolutions that have been passed, the Green New Deal and all the rest, absolutely superb. Tomorrow's, I'm hoping that Keir's speech will be focused on tackling climate change, Green New Deal, etc. There's a rumour going around that some of these apparatchiks are trying to draft him a few sentences like Neil Kinnock to attack the membership. I'm trying to say that would be a complete mistake, because actually we could all get onto the same page tomorrow on how we understand society and where we go from here. And instead of looking like we're irrelevant, as we are doing at this conference at the moment as a result of all these disputes, we can actually demonstrate that we're ahead of any other agency within our society in tackling these particular issues. The key issue for us, though, it isn't about individual leaders. We've demonstrated it's about social movements being developed. And one of those, I failed to mention the community wealth building, but look at that. That's a real practical example, as has been said, about socialism in practice on the ground and how you challenge the system, how you transform it. So even while the Tories are in government, and even while we not have a completely convinced leader of the party, there is work and struggles on the ground that we must persist in, because I think we're winning the argument. I think we're hegemonizing the political debate. It's translating that into an agency in government that enables us to introduce those transformative economics nationally, but then wake up and work up globally with other regimes as well. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Wide-ranging set of speeches. I noticed John actually also kind of blew our cover on the real meaning of transformative. So I think, but you all obviously picked up on this. That's why you're here, right? I'd like to open to the floor at this point. I think we've got a roving mic somewhere. Yes, there we go. Okay, so questions. I think short contributions are fine. Also, I think it's good to actually have a bit of a discussion around some of these things. And I'll bring the panel back, depending on how it goes from there. Maybe we'll do a few rounds of this. So let's see, who have we got? I'm keeping an eye out. Can I take the woman in the keffiyeh at the front?
I wanted to say this somewhere. If we're going to start local, on the bus coming in this morning, I was talking to a young woman who is working at the Hilton Hotel at the moment. She said they're taking on the bar £25,000 a night. They are being forced to work 12-hour shifts. They are not unionised. They're discouraged from stating their opinions. She can't get a bus home at 1 o'clock in the morning. She has to get a taxi. She's not paid to get the taxi home. She is not reimbursed. Please, can you do something about it? Thank you.
Excellent. Straight to the point. I saw some hands at the front. Yeah, good.
Hi, so I'm quite interested in like communally owned, like quite utopian, but like fully automated economy. I think it sort of like simplifies the equation, removes human labour, and sort of like, I don't know, if you can automate like basic services, it frees up people for sort of the stuff that can't be automated or you wouldn't want to automate. So I just want the people who are vested in sort of academic economics sort of opinion on that. Sort of, yeah.
That's good. And this guy just here with the blue top had his hand up a while, just there. Yeah, that's it. Behind. Actually, I mean either really. Don't want to fight.
John, I'm teaching a course on Marxism. Can I have that booklet, please?
Excellent. And the guy behind.
Thanks. This is mainly for Matthew. I was wondering what either legal obstacles or obstacles were put in the way by government when you were trying to instigate things, just generally. And I'm wondering whether anyone else has any ideas about what limits, what obstacles would be likely put in place against people, particularly trying to make changes at local level.
Okay, that's a very good point. Can I just, there's a guy at the back with waving his hand, with long hair. There you go. So it's worth being a chair is like, how do you identify people?
Yeah, this is also kind of a question for John and Matthew. It's basically, and also all the panel, is obviously Preston's a town, so there's already an inherent localized economy which you can then look to like refunnel money through. But what I'm kind of curious about is for, say, if you wanted to implement community wealth building models within singular councils in London, how would that function, or big cities? Like, how do you scale the model up? And like, how does it function the larger and larger and larger it gets, basically?
Okay, thank you. And then just down here with the glasses.
Thank you. It perfectly follows on the last question, because my concern is not scaling up, it's about scaling down. And before Matthew tells you, I think Preston is a city. And the point, I try to think of a question that encompassed everybody, because my concern is the fact that I, 30 years ago, moved to what effectively was a former pit town. 6 years before, it'd been a pit town, okay? 30 years on, that town has doubled in size because of all the development that we all face, and yet still faces immense problems, but does not have the advantages of scale that Preston or other places have. And when I reflect the fact that many of our defeats and many of the problems from Brexit were actually based in and emerged from towns, what I want to know is, what are we going to do about towns? And how do I, as a Labour Party member who lives in a town, translate what you're trying to do to that kind of level?
Okay, thank you. That's a really good set of questions, I think, because there are some quite specific things. I'll take the panel back first and then go to another round, if that's all right. So I had some very definitely on community wealth building, how to scale it up and how to scale it down, I think. So there you go. Can you deal with both ends of that between Matthew and Antonia? Do you want to go first, Antonia? Not really?
Sure. So, yeah, London's a really interesting example to bring up with regards to community wealth building. There are many councils within London firmly committed to community wealth building. And I think the thing to note about, before I talk about what they're doing, about community wealth building is it's a very broad agenda. I talked about the 5 pillars. They're very much live pillars that are being developed. So I think, we need a conversation as progressives around what else we want to trial locally. Do we want to incubate, for example, localized tax schemes or job schemes or whatever it might be. But thinking about London specifically, there's some really interesting work, both going on a borough level, but also across the London as a whole, the assemblies. So, for example, I think one of the most interesting examples is in Newham, who have adopted a community wealth building strategy and put it front and centre of all of their council policies. And what they have interpreted community wealth building to be for them has meant that they've abandoned GDP as the primary indicator of success, and instead now are measuring the success of all of their council policies in terms of reduction in child poverty, reduction in health inequalities, improvements in well-being, etc. And then across London, actually, there's something that's just been launched a few months ago called the London Anchor Network. And anchors, for those of you that haven't heard the term, are basically large public institutions. And the London Anchor Network has just formed, and it involves NHS London, but it also involves the Met, TfL, etc., etc. And basically, they've committed to using their combined purchasing power, employment power, etc., to maximise to improve the lives of the poorest Londoners. And just to give you a sense of scale, I don't have their purchasing power sort of at the top of my head, but I know that collectively they employ nearly 1 in 5 Londoners, and disproportionately they employ those Londoners that are from the poorest wards within the city. So I think community wealth building can work on the regional and kind of higher level quite coherently, and I think it also works well as well because the definition of community within community wealth building is very porous. It's not necessarily regionally defined with a line around it. Yeah.
Can I just do the London bit?
Yeah.
Can I just do the London bit again in terms of we need to learn a bit from what went on previously as well. Owen Hathaway just did a book about London government through the ages. I think it's a really good book. It gets some bits wrong, I think, but there you are. No one's perfect. If I look back to the GLC days, there's an issue here about recognising individual cities and the strategic role that they play. When we had the issue was for the GLC was that we had this in and against the state theory about transfer of power, etc. But the reason we were relatively successful in terms of delivery of bread and butter services, transport, fire, and all the rest of it, and also at the same time we were able to undertake an element of redistribution of wealth and power by the strategies we pursued, was because actually we had a huge resource base, and we did seek to engage. We didn't call them anchors at the time, but we did seek to engage a coordination with as many boroughs as we can, but then with other institutions as well. But and I was at a meeting this morning looking at taxation for local government and resourcing. When I was chair of finance on local government and on the GLC, I had complete control over the business rates and the precept. I had a capital fund. I went to Parliament and we put a bill through Parliament, a capital fund. And it was like nirvana. It was unbelievable. I could spend to the level whatever I want that the electorate can find politically acceptable, and we did. And we turned a 1 billion budget in 1981 into a 4 or 5 billion budget within about 3 years. But what we did with that is we redistributed across London, and we had what we call the community areas policy, so that deprived areas of London, we were transferring resources from the wealthy areas, if you like, the Kensington and Chelseas, into those deprived areas. But we were setting up community structures to enable that to happen. So our plan was every community had a trade union centre, a women's centre, a print shop. We never had social media then. We were training people for community radio licenses and all the rest. And we were trying to resource every community organisation we possibly could, so that as the resources came in, the community itself were then planning the distribution of those resources, the investments in those areas. That's the role. So I think at a strategic level, working with the London boroughs and others, you can see it happening. I think you do have to deal with some cities on that strategic level because of interchange of people, etc. But you can see why Mrs. Thatcher abolished this, though, can't you, as a result?
Okay, just briefly on the point around scaling up. Obviously, a big part of community wealth building is trying to influence others, and obviously that's within a wider region. So I totally get that Preston is quite privileged in the sense we've got lots of public sector, plenty of ideas, but it's also encouraging other authorities in Lancashire to do the same. And we're trying to establish and are establishing, and they're doing this in Wales as well, and the South West and the Bristol area, regional cooperative banks, and that'll go across a footprint of 3 million. So obviously smaller councils can get involved in that. And crucially, policies around worker and employee ownership, trade unions can get involved in that as well. And this is what's really exciting about the CWU, you know, looking at community wealth building and how they could use potentially crammed post offices to not only help trade union members who are struggling and unemployed individuals and those in poverty, but also suggest an alternative economics within place. You know, so that infrastructure is not just local authorities, it's potentially trade unions and others, and even community anchor institutions like football clubs, for example. They potentially can look at where they procure and where they recruit and what they do with the land and assets as well.
There's a question, I think, to two sort of academics, if you like, on the panel about fully automated, not quite fully automated luxury communism, but yours at the front. So.
Yeah, work in automation. Okay, well, at the academic level, yes, that's a topic that has really got economists to look into it, especially because it does, you know, reduce costs. So, of course, in terms of production, it's a very attractive discussion. And yes, we can't, I mean, I like to talk about how economists are not doing so well, but in that case, actually, they do consider the change in the labor market if that happens. So then how we have to train, you know, workers in terms of what we call structural unemployment, to then these workers being able to be hired by whatever is the sector that is coming as a result of this technological change. So in a way, it's kind of an interesting discussion, but you've been talking about Marx here in volume 2 and so on. So I guess what is missing in that discussion is which technology and innovation for what and why we need that, the need for that. Because I think sometimes we see technology as this very neutral kind of intervention in how we produce stuff, and in a way that's going to be always beneficial. But I think the question that's missing is who, first of all, who actually owns that technology, you know, and who is benefiting from it. And that's a discussion also involved with the entire climate change discussion. If you think in terms of innovation in the global south and all these new forms of technology and ways to generate energy, we think, well, that would be great for the global south in terms of how production can be done in a different way. But the reality is that happening? For example, you think in terms of Brazil, who could have a country that can actually rely in new forms of technology, for example, related to solar panels and so on. So we think, well, problem solved. We just have a technology, a cheap technology that is going to help in that way. But then we have Germans and Chinese companies like developing high-tech technology, going to Brazil and offering a different kind of agenda regarding climate change for a problem that doesn't exist in Brazil, because Brazil has never been a coal burn kind of country when generating or trying to industrialize. So I think we need, the question of technological development and automation is it has to come together. A second question, which is why we are developing that and for what. I think we have to face that. During the pandemic, for example, we saw the government in the UK trying to propping up hospitality and retail job, and that was a good thing. But at the same time, we have all this, how actually COVID-19 has accelerated and speed up the pace of technological change. So what we need here is, if that has happened, we need to look at the labor market, and that goes back to my the initial point in my talk, how we're dealing with these changes in the labor market regarding the workers, how we can actually protect the workers from that change, and how that actually, what that implies for the government and costs regarding this training. So I think we just have to avoid thinking of technological developments in a very positive way and be more skeptical about this. Sorry.
Let me just respond to the question of automation. I got a long chapter on it, and I've been, for some reason, invited to Silicon Valley a number of times to talk about this particular subject. This is the first technological revolution in history, which is labor-saving. In other words, some of the machines are replacing labor, but is also increasing work. And it's a phenomenon that's called by the engineering people looking at this process heteromation as opposed to automation. This is an incredible feature of it, that the artificial intelligence systems and the apps is resulting in a vast increase in the amount of work the precariat have to do that is not remunerated or recognized in any statistics, any textbook, and so on. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is a sort of globalized labor process that's taking place that I think before my generation fade off the scene will mean that well over 1/3 of all labor will be done online. And we will not actually be operating in an economy that has a lot of jobs per se. We have apps-driven concierge economy, servants, we Uber and all the rest of it. We have Amazon Turk, which at the moment, millions and millions of people are competing online across the world to do tasks, not just low-level tasks, but high-level tasks. Legal work, medical work, a whole lot of things. So you have people in Goa competing with people in Preston or wherever, and they're driving down the real wage rate to an extraordinarily low level. Okay, that is the reality of it. And we haven't begun to adjust to this online process. But the calculations I've got show that the apps, the people who own the apps, are the rentiers. They are making 25%, 50% of every transaction. So this gives them enormous rental power that we need to be thinking about. It's another feature of rentier capitalism. And the labor process is going to be fundamentally transformed, whatever we want to use the word, but we have to begin to think about how we respond to that process. And so far, we haven't done so. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we've only got time for I'm trying to see if one of the organisers here, but I think we've got time for another round because we started a bit late. Also, it's kind of pissing down, so I don't imagine anybody wants to leave. So let's take a couple of questions. Looking for over here. Haven't really gone here yet. Here, just take yourself in the white T-shirt. Do you want a microphone?
Yeah, thanks very much to all the panelists. I want to just articulate a brief concern that, like, apart from John at the very end of his intervention, there's just been no mentioning of climate and ecological breakdown on this panel. And I think, you know, it's super important. Like, I share lots of the analysis about transformative politics, but honestly, if our transformative policies fail to integrate, not add on, integrate, make it front of center, climate and ecological breakdown, then it's not fit for purpose for the 21st century. I think we got to be honest and face that. So 2 questions. One is, how do you propose to integrate that? Again, not add on. How is it integral to transformative politics? And specifically, how do you position yourself within that context to questions of growth or overcoming growth, not just capitalism, but growth, right? Is it a socialism? Are we talking about a socialism that continues to grow, or a socialism that also tackles the idea of the scale of consumption and production, not just the mode? Thank you.
Thanks for that. Did I see a hand over at the other side in the red top? The guy there? Oh, which way?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, my name's Jonathan. I work for a Labour council that would love to pay living wages to care staff, etc., but just can't afford it. And that's been the case for many years. But I wanted to feed back here. I've been to the World Transformed events since the first one in 2016 in Liverpool. And I just wanted to say, though, that everyone wants here to talk about the ending of austerity. No one wants to talk about more money to the state. Every time I raised it at anything, no one wants to talk about giving more money to the state to do that. And when my heart goes out to you for the not winning in 2019, obviously, but I looked in disappointment at the manifesto in 2019 because it didn't really give much more money to the state. I mean, taxing and spending, right-wing politicians in Europe are comfortable with higher levels of state spending than what was in the manifesto. And my hunch is that, you know, Carolina, you talked about the vilification of the state from economists, but I feel there is also that within, the one thing that left and right in this country can agree on is how they feel about, for example, bureaucrats, of which I am one. And I don't know what my point is, but... All
right. Thanks. I think one more question, anyone or somebody? You kind of already had a bite at it. It's okay. I'll take. Sorry about this. Can I? Where are we going? Oh God. Yeah, go on. All right, go on. Follow on. Go on. Just very quickly.
Sorry about that. It's me again. I love robots, so let's talk about robots. So I think it was just misunderstood a bit because I guess there's a view from sort of people that like automation. It's always viewed as like an opposition to sort of like your job and. I guess it does increase labour when sort of like it's not fully automated because you're just sort of filling this very menial role in between all these robots. But like I guess you could sort of take it from the view like this doesn't have to be owned by the companies and like sort of you're talking about who owns it. If we build it, we own it. So if you buy like a hydroponics farm and are able to automate the irrigation, the seeding and the harvesting, and that is owned. Obviously, it's a very political problem to own who owns it and how that's distributed. But you've got free food, right? And you own that.
Free food.
Yeah.
And there's just one at the back. There you go. This side, the left, on the left there, my left. Yeah.
Thank you. My question is about, it sort of links in with one of the other questions before, which was related to, I guess, you know, machines doing work for people. And it's like most apps, a few people make the app and someone, you know, there's just a limited number of people that make money out of it. And with a lot of things where machines are doing labor, there's just a few people that own the machines necessarily but make the money. And it's about how to maybe introduce decentralization. It could be things like email or even a broader chain like the blockchain when it comes to crypto. So it isn't just a few people making the money, and it also might help, I guess, when it comes to things going down when one service breaks. When you decentralize it, it can still run usually. So it's just how to bring that in if that's a good idea. It might go into open source, whatever. So anyway, thank you.
Well, thank you. I think I'm going to have to bring back the panel at this point because we are pushing time a bit. That kind of opened up some fairly fundamental questions. So thank you for that. And we can get a bit of time to address, I think, one about growth and relation to climate change. I thought it was a very good point, and by the way, and also issues of taxation and then decentralization, some clarification at the front. But can I bring people back in, what order should we go in? Sort of reverse order, would that make sense? So that's you first, John.
Just on the issue around growth, etc. When we were planning the last manifesto, actually I brought the Extinction Rebellion in to meet the Treasury team and to brief the Shadow Cabinet as well. We were looking at Rebecca Long-Bailey's Green New Deal, Green Industrial Revolution, etc. It wasn't growth-oriented. The only investment that was going in wasn't about the growth and use of materials. It was the selective and very, I think actually astute mechanisms of investment that would then restrain the traditional concept of growth itself. And we were trying to build into everything, and James was there as well, a whole concept of a well-being budgetary action that took place. So it was a holistic, it sounds like a therapist, but it was like a holistic approach to how we designed, how we went forward as an economy. So we were very careful about that, but also trying to be honest with people about what could be achieved and where restraints had to be. And in our first manifesto, we won the argument, for example, on fracking with some of the unions that were really coming at us because they said you haven't demonstrated to us just transition effectively yet. So that debate was there going on all the time. But it's one that we need to, I agree with you, we need to come back because it's a sophisticated approach that's required. Otherwise, we could be in a situation where we're conned in by individual corporations, especially, who are greenwashing their policies and their productive capacity. Finally, just on this not putting money into the state, the budget was 80 billion additional a year, some of which were transfer payments, but most of it was going via the state into public services. And then on top of that, a 450 billion pound programme for in terms of the green infrastructure and social infrastructure that we invested in. So alongside the manifesto, we published a grey book. James was involved in developing that. And so actually, the scale of resource that was going into the state was unheard of in comparison with what has been promised in by previous Labour governments or investment. The issue there then was we got challenged, where do you find the money from? We had all the crap about the magic money tree. Well, actually, when we went into COVID, they didn't have a problem finding the money then, did they? So I don't think that's ever going to be challengeable again. We've demonstrated, and we have to be careful about the language that's being used in the Labour Party again at the moment. We've demonstrated the state is not run like a household budget. That isn't the way we calculate things. We can create resources, and we can ensure those resources are available for the state to tackle the priority needs of our community. And the issue around socialism is that we believe in planning, and that's the whole process that we're going through, that manifesto. But James will send you a copy of the grey book, 80 billion and 450 billion. So it was a slight oversight in saying there was no money going to the state.
I just would like to respond on the ecological thing. I spoke yesterday about how the threat of extinction is, I think, going to be the decisive factor in convincing people that we need a basic income. And in my books, I've proposed the creation of a commons capital fund, where we would have no less than 17 eco taxes or levies, whatever you want to call them, that we need to fund. And the good thing about eco taxes is that basically you can see pollution as an erosion of our commons. And unfortunately, carbon taxes, which we need, high carbon taxes, they are regressive by themselves. That's why we had the Gilets jaunes in France. They only become progressive if you guarantee that the revenue, one way or the other, is going to be recycled in the form of common dividends. But we can do a capital fund, we can build a capital fund, and it must be ecologically driven. So I think that that is a part of the answer. But it's absolutely fundamental to the left in the next phase that we have it ecologically driven, ecological and common justice, and I totally agree with your point.
Yeah, I echo a lot of what's been said. I guess just to directly address the point of what can be achieved on the local with regards to the climate emergency, I actually think the climate emergency, ecological crisis presents a huge window of opportunity to call for a lot more power on the local level, because on the road to net zero, the three probably primary ways most people are going to experience their lives changing are around travel, around food, and around insulation. They're all things that can and should be dealt with on the local level, not least because the needs of regions are completely different. If you live in the Outer Hebrides, it's not going to be the same road to net zero as if you live in Newham. There's been some amazing work done recently by the Green Alliance as well, showing the potential for nature-based jobs in different parts of the country. And all of this, sort of developing emerging research strongly supports the fact that we can't have a one-size-fits-all policy with regards to this stuff, and we need bespoke approaches in every region, and therefore I think, as progressives, we should be calling for that.
Just briefly to touch on two issues. Lots of talk about technology and digital technology. I remember seeing David Bowie being interviewed by Jeremy Paxman in 2000, and he was talking about, Paxman was saying, well, the internet is a tool. David, why actually getting this Bowie net and all the rest of it? He said, well, it's got to have transformative potential for good and bad. It's obviously my favourite musician was way ahead of the presenter at the time, but he was right. Yeah. But it was, it was obviously right in the sense that that gives us big potential, even for the labour movement. So one of our first worker cooperatives is our taxi drivers who are organising on an app. Self-employed individuals, South Asian community in Preston, supported by the RMT, legally organising in a worker cooperative. We've got another one, Preston Digital Foundation. So if the trade union movement and the labour movement can seize this technology, because if extractive capitalists like Uber come up with a way of exploiting wealth the way they do by reclassifying people as self-employed and using that technology, it can be used with a bit of creativity by the labour movement, the trade union movement and the cooperative movement, who need to work together a lot more, in my opinion. The values are shared. That's the first thing. In terms of, and sorry for digressing to David Bowie, I do apologise for that. I don't know. It's been a long week. I don't know why I'm getting this obscure with some of the things I'm saying. Yeah, and then in terms of the Green New Deal, totally correct. Community wealth building is very much about the Green New Deal. Obviously, divesting pension funds from fossil fuels and reinvesting a little of them in local economies, potentially in clean energy systems there. Obviously, publicly owned energy networks, if you can do that legally, and community ownership there, and retrofitting. In Preston, we're very keen with our strategy to look at how we can get democratic companies in supply chains through retrofitting, because even the Conservatives will be giving local governments some money for that, really. So all these things are really important, but I think, for me, really, there's lots of opportunities, and we've got to grab them, really, because the system is leading to that many inequalities. We've got to look at where the dynamic is and looking at these opportunities and be creative, because we ain't going to fight austerity and the failures of neoliberal capitalism without a bit of creativity.
Yeah, just a comment on the vilification of the state and then the climate change aspect. Because also these 2 points, it gives me the opportunity to go back to the market and the free market, if it exists or if it doesn't exist. So I think we can, when I mentioned that we can go back to the 90s and see the evidence of how this kind of market approach was behind what happens to the state, I was specifically referring to something we call the new public management. And I think everyone here who works or have worked or used to work for the state in UK, you know that how we have this inflow of policies regarding marketization, privatization, the public and private partnership. Indeed, most of the workers, especially in the HDHS and other segments of the state, they become bureaucrats. And we have this market-centric approach that did happen, especially with Reagan and Thatcher. And I think one thing that was there, this slimming down of the state, it implied to cut costs. And that was actually embraced by major political parties in Anglo-Saxon countries, regarding if they're left or Tories. And I think what we need is, I'm not disagreeing with what John has already said, but I haven't seen yet the reversal of this new public management kind of approach within the state. We haven't, we can allocate money to that, but we need to reverse that changes that we've seen in the 80s, in the 70s, in the end of the 70s and 80s, where we have this imposition of this market-centric approach in the public sector. So perhaps together with the money that has been allocated, we need to go back there and trying to think of a new way to organize the public sector where the market-centric approach is not there, so we're not really looking to cutting costs and so on. So I think this is something that can be combined, and perhaps you can have more answers to that. And I think he is important to highlight again what I meant by the market-centric approach and all this market fundamentalism, because if you look again in UK in the 1980s, the cost of slimming down the state was huge, so there was indeed intervention, right? So we had at the time in the 1980s, 1990s in the UK, 5%. We could see in the NHS, for example, 5% of the costs going to administrative costs. By the time we are in the 2005, this is 14%. So obviously there was an intervention. To support this market fundamentalism, we do have intervention. So we have to be very careful just to say there is no market fundamentalism there and kind of be a little bit more polished by that argument. And that takes me to the climate change point. To go back to this market approach, when I was saying that we need to train economists in a different way, this is also regarding how we organize production, of course, because if we still organizing production around market and profit, we can't have a discussion about climate change. A concrete example we had 2 weeks ago, and it's going to take me back to the market fundamentalism. We have now a combination of lawyers at the international level and economists actually suing governments because of regulation, anti-pollution regulation that will stop their profit. And the core of the argument, you know what is? Free trade. Okay, so is that how we're training our economists? So we do need, I will take back to how I started my talk, how we actually can see society, organize society with a different lenses that not the market lenses.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you for what I think was a very, very good discussion. We can just remind you that the PEF book is sitting at the front over here with contributions from some of the people in the panel to solutions to the various problems we face. And I've just asked you to thank the panel again for their contributions. And thank you.